Hi, I'm Trinity, and I'm an ERP advisor with Striven, and today we're covering vendor management. And in this video, we're going to talk about setting up your purchase orders. So we're going to talk about setting up your purchase order types, and then also the default payment terms and the default terms and conditions that can be associated with those purchase order types. So let's jump right in and get started. There's a few steps you'll need to take to set up your system so you can start using purchase orders. To do so, you'll go to Company, and then Settings, and then click on Accounting and AP. There's a few different pages in here that we'll visit, but let's go ahead and start with Terms and Conditions. So your terms and conditions in the system actually can be stored for orders, recruiting, surveys, quizzes, assessments, forms, public forms, and then also, of course, purchase orders. When I go to add a new purchase order, it's going to allow me to check off which terms or which entity these terms and conditions should be applicable to. So for our purposes, we would choose purchase order. I'll give my terms and conditions a name, and then I'm going to put in the content, which is the actual terms that I'm speaking about. Hit Save and Close, and now my terms and conditions are set. Now that's to store them in your system. Next, we're going to go ahead and set up our payment terms to store them in the system, and then we're going to set up the type, which then you're associating these to your PO type then. So let's move on up to payment terms, which is right underneath the PO submenu. Now we do have default ones in the settings for you, but you can create your own or edit any of the existing ones by clicking on the name here. You notice I'm unable to delete a few. That's because this one, for example, is set as the default, so you cannot delete the default payment term. And this one is actually set as a default in the AR settings, so that's why it's not letting me delete that as well. Let's go ahead and add a new one. So for my purposes, I'm going to give it a name. Let's say ours is going to be net 5. So that means they have 5 days that I need to pay the bill for, or else it's considered late. So for the term days, I would put that number again, 5, and then I can decide if it's a default or has a discount. Selecting has a discount will bring up some important information, such as percentage, days, account, and class if you have that feature turned on. I'm going to go ahead and hit Save for the payment term to take effect. So now we set up our terms and conditions in the system and our payment terms in the systems, and now it's time to move on to setting up our PO types. So I'm going to go right over here to the submenu and click on PO types right under the AP tab. Now we do have some default ones, of course, in the system for you, which you can use or edit as needed, or you can create a new one by clicking the Add button. Let's go ahead and give our PO type a name, and then we have some options down here to choose from. So we have is default. Now this is going to say that this type of purchase order is always going to be the default. So when I go to create a purchase order, it's going to select this one for me for convenience, but I can override that if I need to. Requires internal approval means that you'll send it to someone internally to view it before it can be sent over to the vendor so they can approve it to make sure things are being entered correctly. Allow recurring will allow you to set up this PO to recur on a regular basis based on the recurrence setting that you set up when you go to create the PO. Under that now we have our display fields. So this is you deciding what do you want displayed on the purchase order. The PO name, the promise date, and if the promise date should also include a time, who is the requested by, and who is the vendor contact. So the requested by will allow you to indicate who internally in your company is the one who is requesting this purchase order to be sent, whereas the vendor contact is who on the vendor side of things are you dealing with for this purchase order. So then now we have some advanced settings with our contract managed. So checking this off is going to bring up some additional settings, which includes those terms and conditions like I mentioned. So when I click the drop down, I can then choose those ones we just created. Notice hovering over the field will allow me to create new ones on the fly. The requirements section then is letting you decide, does the vendor need to enter tracking information? Maybe they shouldn't be able to necessarily move forward unless they've submitted tracking information for you. And then also we have requires vendor acceptance. Now when I check this off, I'm going to have some additional options that show up. So I can then choose how will the vendor accept this? Electronically, written, or verbal? I'm going to go ahead and choose all for my purposes. Notice once I choose written and verbal, I have an extra option to require attachment. I'm going to go ahead and uncheck that for verbal as I don't think it makes much sense, but it definitely makes sense for written. Now instead of hitting save and close, I'm going to hit save so I stay on this page because now that my PO type has been created, I have some additional options up here at the top. Let's go ahead and take a look at the acceptance notification. So acceptance notifications is going to allow you to set up who should be notified when these purchase orders are accepted by the vendors. It's very simple to set up. All you'll need to do is click Add Recipient. Now, on the recipient, you can select a particular employee, but if you notice, you can also just enter a straight email. So, for example, if you have a warehouse catch-all email or something like that, you can have that email set here to make sure the appropriate people get notified when these purchase orders are accepted. You can also specify division. Order total greater than means that I only want to be notified when the order has a greater total than X amount. So maybe I only need to be notified for those large orders and not necessarily the day-to-day purchases that go on. And then I can even specify specific items. So maybe I only want to be notified when this item is on a purchase order or when this item's on a purchase order. So you can get very granular and very specific with when you want to be notified. Hitting save and close will add this to the notification list, but keep in mind you can set up multiple recipients, so there's no limit to who should be notified under what conditions for these purchase orders. Moving over to the next tab, we're now moving on to our custom fields. Custom fields in Striven allow you to pretty much create your own fields that you want to capture information about for either the customers, the vendors, the employees, the items. Pretty much any entity in the system will have its own custom fields that you can create. There's no exception to purchase orders. So on your purchase order type, I can actually create custom fields to gather additional information or track additional information on the PO. I would simply click this little plus sign, which is the Add Custom Field button. Give it a name. Perhaps with my company and my vendors, I have a process where they may either drop off items or they may ship items. So maybe I want to specify that on the PO. My field type then allows me to show how do I want to capture this information. Now, it may not always make sense for what you're trying to capture. For example, with this one, I want to know if the item's going to be shipped or dropped off at a location. It may not make sense to have a decimal type field for the answer for that. So you want to make sure it makes sense for what you're trying to capture. But just to kind of give you an idea, you have your alphanumeric, which is numbers and letters, so you could just type in a sentence into here. Integer is only going to be numbers, and it will put that comma into the thousand place. Decimal, currency, date and time, or you can separate them out and have them just date and just time. Yes or no field, alphanumeric multi-line field, so that's very similar to the alphanumeric, but it's going to be multiple lines, so you can click enter to go to the next line for additional information when you're typing in. Attachment, select value from a custom list or an existing list. So a custom list is just that. You're creating your own custom list, whereas existing list is the ones that are within the system. So your employees, your customers, your vendors, your contacts, all of those. So for this one, I left it kind of an either or type of question. So let's go ahead and choose from a custom list. Now I can choose from the drop down here if I've already created my list, or I can use the plus sign to create a new one right from here. So I give my list a name, and then I'm going to give the options that I want available for them to select. Once I'm ready, I hit save and close, and I now have my custom list available. On some of these field types, you'll notice when you select them, you do have a display type as well. So you can change how do you want that field to be displayed to. And then you can choose if it's required. Something to keep in mind is some of the fields also, such as alphanumeric, you can set as encrypted as well. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save and close, and I now have my custom field within my purchase order type. So those are the steps you'll need to take to set up your purchase orders to start using them inside of Striven. So we covered setting up your payment terms, your terms and conditions, creating your PO types, and then who's getting notified for those POs, and then also what information are you capturing on that PO. In our next video, we're going to go through actually making a purchase order and going through the steps of managing purchase orders.